Hi, I'm David Bush, Executive Director for Preservation Houston. Thank you for being with us this evening for our look at modern Melbourne, Australian architecture from 1920 to 1956. This is Preservation Houston's first international program. Our speaker is actually across the international date line where it's already tomorrow morning, so that's something to wrap your heads around. Tonight's presentation is part of the Bart Truxillo program series named in memory of the pioneer preservationist and Preservation Houston co-founder, and supported in part by contributions from Preservation Houston members and friends. If you're interested in helping us keep presenting programs like this, you can text PresHou, P-R-E-S-H-O-U, to the number 44321, or visit preservationhouston.org/donate. Preservation Houston is offering tonight's program as a key contact of the International Coalition of Art Deco Societies, a cooperative worldwide alliance of organizations with an interest in Art Deco and modernist architecture and design. And now I'm going to turn it over to Preservation Houston's Programs Director, Jim Parsons, who will introduce our speaker.
Thanks, David, and thanks everybody for joining us tonight. I have tried to get my head around the idea that it's Wednesday morning in Australia, and I have never been able to figure that one out. I'm happy to introduce our speaker, Robin Grow, who is the long-term president of the Art Deco and Modernism Society of Australia, which is an international organization that celebrates all aspects of Art Deco and modernist design. He's active in the preservation of interwar and modernist buildings, and he regularly gives tours and presentations on the subject. And I can tell you, Robin gives an excellent tour of Melbourne. I was lucky enough to meet up with him and his wife, Robin, when I was over there last summer, our time, and winter, their time. And we saw a lot of fantastic buildings. And so I'm looking forward to seeing what he talks about tonight, because I think I'll see some familiar sights. Robin is the author of the award-winning book, Melbourne Art Deco, and the recently completed book, Melmo, Modernist Architecture in Melbourne. And Robin, we're happy to have you, and take it away, and I will see you for the Q&A.
And welcome, everybody. I'd like to thank Jim and David for the invitation to speak to you today. Now, we're in Melbourne. It's not Florida, and it's not Melbourne Street in Houston, but it's in Australia. And Melbourne is one of the cities, one of the country's largest cities, capital of the state of Victoria. I wanted to do just a brief history about Melbourne. It was an outpost of the British Empire, founded in 1834, which dates it just before Houston was founded. Then gold came along in the mid-1850s, and we had 500,000 newcomers, mainly from Britain, including many of the 49ers from California. So the colony became very, very rich and a major city in Victorian style. But then it suffered some booms and busts. By the 1920s, it was recovering from the Great War and the Spanish flu pandemic. In the 1930s, it was transformed to a wonderful centre of Art Deco, which we all know is the first truly international style. So this presentation will describe and show how the interwar years saw a new spirit of modernism take over, which was extended in post-war years and culminating in the 1956 Olympic Games, the first in the Southern Hemisphere. Changes to society will also be included, and we'll discover the buildings that have been the centre of preservation efforts by our society. So join me as we ride on the famous train, the Spirit of Progress, on a journey through Melbourne, together with some other Australian cities. The Spirit is the symbol of our society, as we can see on the right-hand side there. But let's talk about aviation. In the 1930s, aviators were like today's rock stars. And in 1934, there was a famous air race from London to Melbourne, which celebrated Melbourne's centenary. The winner was in 3 days, a British de Havilland, an exemplar of Art Deco streamlining. Here we see it on the right, called Grosvenor House. A US entrance came second in a Boeing, the Warner Brothers Comet, flown by a guy called Roscoe Turner, who was an extravagant character. It really generated massive interest around the world, and people followed the activities closely. So here we show see the building of a modern city. Here we see these guys. They're pouring concrete. They're riding steel girders, sawing. carrying, all those sorts of things that happened. And this is a rare, unusual example of a frieze. It's found on a back streets, on a foundry in the back streets of an industrial suburb of Melbourne. It also shows how the artists stylised the human body in this area, emphasising the planes. I doubt very much that working men would have looked like that in those days. Melbourne has some wonderful deco houses. This is in a suburb called Balwyn, and it's one of many with nautical styling, which was a feature of the era. So we're seeing portholes, stylised metal balustrades, etched glass in the stairwell, and a cantilevered porch. And these bold houses generally embraced the latest styling throughout, with generous balconies and internal features such as curved staircases, chromed balustrades, geometric light fittings, large fireplaces, and built-in cocktail cabinets, together with modernist furniture appropriate for the style. Now, the wonderful material of concrete became used widely in construction, and steel reinforced concrete revolutionised building. But they didn't know how long the material would last, so there was lots of experimentation to determine the correct placement of the metal rods within the concrete. Because what happened when water penetrated the surface, it rusted the rods. They had expanded and damaged the concrete, which we know today as concrete cancer. The cement rendering became the favourite finish on buildings. Another new material that was used was rounded or bent glass. And houses using rounded glass were often described as waterfall designs. And the glass itself, as we see on the right-hand side, could often be etched and include wonderful patterns. Cantilevering was a result of the strength of concrete, which enabled cantilevered stairs, balconies, etc. So on the right, we see an example of an extreme semicircular balcony. On the left, we see a staircase. Now, when the builder finished this, he was reluctant to go on it. He didn't want to walk up it. The architect virtually made him do it. No problems, and within a few minutes, his young workers, were scurrying up and down this staircase. The 1930s saw a number of wonderful new buildings in Melbourne. Left is Manchester Unity. It can be seen as commercial Gothic. We use the term Art Deco as an umbrella phrase, so we slip the commercial Gothic in there. It's a bit like the Chicago Tribune, if you know that building. But one of the things it did was introduce colour to the city. We were a drab and grey city until the Deco era. On the right-hand side, we have Ewell House. This was the first commercial building in definite Deco style. And we know when it was built, we can see that, and that should be compulsory on all buildings from this era to have the date on it. And what we see here is stylised lettering, incisions in the brick, and speed lines or speed whiskers across the facade there. Metal framed windows were being introduced. The lettering is interesting because there was a major battle in the Deco era in the world of typography. New typefaces were introduced, where the letters and numbers were redesigned and changed dramatically. No serifs, no capitals, and a combination of thick and thin lines. And in this building, down at the ground level, we see an S redesigned as a sinuous snake. So very, very stylish lettering in those days, which then became used in posters, business letterheads, newspaper ads, etc. So it really was a time of transition. One of the other materials that was widely used was terracotta. It was a new material, it was colourful, durable, and reduced building costs, which was very, very important to the people putting up the money for construction. It could be manufactured off-site and then attached to a steel frame, and it made a major contribution to the colorisation of the city. And this is a building called McPherson's, which was a hardware manufacturer's headquarters. Shopping was very important, of course, and here we see Melbourne's retail heart centred on the department stores in Burke Street, and we'll see a few of those. The Myer department store started the trend for department stores. Remarkably, most remain, even if they're no longer used as department stores. In 1933, Sid Meier acquired a number of buildings and designed a new store that tied them all together. Highly symmetrical, and the building appears to be a little squat because Melbourne had a height limit of 120 feet on buildings until the 1960s. The major feature of the building, though, was it was finished in dazzling white using a product called snowcrete. So if you went into the city centre, you could not miss Myers. It also included a mural hall, which is used as a restaurant, and it's one of the few left in the world. Department stores all had these spaces, generally resumed for retail space, but thankfully the mural hall remains. This was nominated to the Victorian Heritage Register, so that's our equivalent of your Landmarks Commission, by our society, just in time, and it's recently been upgraded internally and the facade restored. Although, like all other retail businesses at the moment, they're having a lot of trouble. Another nearby, adjacent to Myers, was the Buckley's men's store. This was a remodelling of an older building that took place in 1934. It's a simple box form, finished in black terracotta tiles and a series of metal zigzags that provided a contrast with the nearby dazzling white of the Myers store. Notable for its large expanse of glass and its geometric and zigzag styling, which gave it an industrial edge in the heart of the city. A whimsical highlight is a series of 3 colourful friezes at the roofline, depicting the types of clothes able to be purchased by a gentleman. This was an upmarket store. One frieze shows a party boy with a pink cocktail. Cocktails became very popular in Melbourne, particularly amongst the women, but men also took to them, and that overrides the myth somehow that real men only drank whiskey and beer. Another nearby department store was Foy and Gibson's. Now, Foy's used the shape that was commonly used on corners: long horizontal wings, a rounded semicircular section dominating the corner. For building during the Depression years, it was important that renovations and updates could take place while the store was still trading. And you can see from the 2 photos that it was extended upwards. Now, this was a favourite of people in Melbourne, because every Christmas they put up this huge Father Christmas on the corner there. And if you have a look up at the top, you can see a rooftop garden up there. Now, there's no way known you'd have that, be able to run one of those these days, but nobody seemed to worry too much for a long, long time. Whilst cement render was popular, bricks were still popular as well, and often provided patterns and motifs, and they were stepped and geometric. And here we see the distinctive use of bricks at the chemistry building at Melbourne University, 1938. 3 sets of bricks laid on an angle, like rockets set to launch. And this was the era of Buck Rogers, and so everybody was excited with the prospect of going into space, something that Houston later played a major role in, of course. The flat roof of the building also suited the chemistry students. They could do their experiments outside on the roof and not worry about blowing the building up. Here we see a building called Newspaper House with a frieze on it. This is in Collins Street. Melbourne has comparatively few murals and friezes on buildings from the era because they had to be funded by the building owners, and they are often reluctant to spend the extra money. There are numerous examples in the USA, of course, because they were funded by the government under the WPA. But this is from the first floor in Collins Street. This was Newspaper House, formerly owned by Keith Murdoch, the father of Rupert. No, you can't send him back. In 1933, the mural was created on the facade. It's entitled, "I'll Put a Girdle Round About the Earth," a quote from Shakespeare. It was designed to show how industry, manufacturing, agriculture, commerce, education were all becoming available in a shrinking world that was occurring by mass-produced newspapers, radio transmissions, telephones, and how the improved methods of transport were contributing to this phenomenon. And here we see ships, planes, cars, rail. There's even a Zeppelin in there. It was highly colourful, skillfully done, and full of symbolism, including much from the world of Freemasonry. On the industrial side, we had GMH set up a factory in 1936. It began manufacturing cars here, and they later produced Australia's first car, the Holden. And here we're seeing the Deco style administration building. When GM vacated the site in the 1990s, this was converted to an industrial park, and I'm happy to say it's still there. We didn't have skyscrapers, The closest we had was a mini skyscraper, and this was police headquarters in 1939. It was cream brick, designed by the government architect, and housed the first radio-controlled police fleet, one of the world's first. It was successfully converted to apartments in 1990s, and just shows that when a developer can work with preservationists, you end up with a really good outcome. A major change to housing in this era in Melbourne was the emergence of flats. They were all rentals. Flats often had exotic names to attract tenants. So a place like Mandalay was very popular, but not Woy Woy. Woy Woy was a small town in the country where the mother of the owner of the block lived, and he said, "I'll call it after Woy Woy. I'm not worried about a fascinating name from another city." The development of flats was a worldwide trend to more communal styles of city living, and coincided with the Art Deco era. So controversy raged for years over the effects of flat living. Major casualties were often seen as family life, privacy, and the inability of children to play in gardens. But flat life was popular with independent young people, particularly those who'd previously been tenants in boarding houses, and those with little interest in garden, childless couples, and those seeking convenience, freedom, and privacy. They wanted to be near transport, the beach, and the entertainment, such as the dance halls, the cinema, and the skating rinks. The blocks of flats generally featured minimum external decoration, often included rounded walls, curved and deep balconies, and dramatic large metal frame windows that allowed light and sunshine to flood in. They're constructed of steel reinforced concrete and generally finished in cement render. They also generally had flat roofs, which were good for hanging washing and for parties. This is a block called Ostend in Brighton, seaside suburb of Brighton, and it's a curved, stylish block on the seafront, and it's near the Brighton Baths, which were recently refurbished. And these is an example of how a couple of buildings in a not a rundown area, but a deteriorating area can regenerate and rejuvenate a whole area, and that's what happened here. The building itself has boat sheds included in it, and it was highly visible from the sea. So it was an icon for sailors out on the ocean there. One of the major activities of people in Melbourne was going to the pub or hotels. Hotels were designed for men to drink in. Women weren't allowed in the public bar, and they generally had a small parlour or a ladies' lounge. Many pubs were updated and remodelled both internally and externally in the 1930s. So stricter government licensing requirements resulted in the installation of new equipment for the storage, cooling and dispensing of beer. And there were a number of architects who specialised in the remodelling. This is the Terminus Hotel out of Melbourne, distinguished by its flat surfaces, speed lines, a stylish simple letter, which I just love, and vertical lines, 4 of them over the curved corner section there. Melbourne boasted a number of new hotels in the era, not just remodelled ones, and the United Kingdom Hotel was purpose-built. Its major feature is an ocean liner appearance. It was designed to resemble a liner ploughing through the waves with a superstructure and ship's railings, with the front section finished in terracotta, brick banding and sweeping balconies. The 2-storey hotel also featured windows with geometric designs. An important feature that we see here is how they use the brickwork in the fabric of the building as almost as decoration. It's now the world's most beautiful McDonald's, and the photographer here skillfully managed to remove the Macca's sign from his photo. Melbourne's a major sporting city, dominated by football and cricket. Australian football began in the 1850s. It's been described as the glue that holds Melbourne together. It's hard, tough and skillful, and there's a national league mainly centred in Melbourne. Just about everyone supports a team and it draws huge crowds. My team includes a 7-foot-tall Texan. Unfortunately, he doesn't have little brothers to come along and play as well. The Art Deco era resulted in a new football grandstand at Glenferrie Oval. It opened in June 1938. Most other clubs had their grandstands designed in the 19th century. The red brick stand strongly resembles an ocean liner. highly nautical, all sweeping lines and curves, with characteristic features of modern style, such as porthole windows, glass bricks, and daring cantilevers. This was designed by one of our prominent architects. The fact that his father-in-law was on the committee that awarded the building to him had nothing to do with him getting the contract, I can assure you. Now, one of the major things that happened in Melbourne was going to the movies or the pictures. It was a favourite pastime for the people of Melbourne. Early theatres were mainly city-based and were ornate, elaborate picture palaces because that was the model they had to work with. But then along came, in 1922, along came the American modernist Walter Burley Griffin and his wife Marion Mahoney Griffin. They'd worked with Frank Lloyd Wright and then won the competition to design Canberra, the new capital of Australia, before relocating to Melbourne. This is the only picture theatre they ever did. And there were elaborate light shows in the ceiling lights. So if you didn't like the photo, the film, you could just watch what was going on in the ceiling. And here we see the interior of the Capitol ceiling and its walls. It included this fantastic cubist style ceiling. Unfortunately, it was modified in the 1960s to introduce a shopping area, but ironically, it brought the ceiling closer to the patrons. It's recently been restored and back to its stunning best. It certainly is one of the world's great picture theatres from this era. But cinemas moved out to the suburbs and were designed in Art Deco style, particularly after the introduction of talkies. They attracted customers, not just with the latest films, but with colourful interiors, attention to sound quality, materials such as terrazzo floors, neon signage, and comfortable seats. They often also had crying rooms, so a mother could bring a baby along, park it in a lounge outside, get given a number, and if the baby started to cry, they'd flash the number up on the screen. I can't see that happening today. On the screen, Hollywood films spread the images of modernism, elegance, and style, particularly the films from MGM, where Cedric Gibbons was in charge of design. Another wonder material of the date was terrazzo, a combination of marble and concrete. It was durable, colourful, and hard-wearing, and often used in cinemas and the bathrooms of houses. This is one of our better examples from around the city. Now, if we look inside the picture theatres, as they were called, we see a ticket box designed as a spaceship. And we also see on the left there the terrazzo floor of the Astor Theatre. The design of the theatre was deliberate to make sure that the customers left the ticket box and swirled upstairs to go past the candy bar. Now, there was no accidents in here. There was a deliberate policy to get people to go to the candy bar. And here we see the Sun Theatre, which was restored. Many cinemas were deteriorated after television introduced in 1956. Many were destroyed. The interior of this one was restored in the 1990s and a multiplex created with new cinemas. And it's another story of how the restoration of a single building, in this case the Sun Theatre, turned it into a central point for the whole community. This was a pretty drab area before the restoration of the Sun. It's now a thriving inner suburban hub. Hospitals were very important in Melbourne. These were intermediate hospitals that could be afforded by most people, and we had a number of them in the era, often in streamlined and later style, and they included the Freemasons on the left and the Mercy Hospital, Roman Catholic Mercy Hospital. They were opposite each other in East Melbourne, designed by the same architects. And it's a little ironic because traditionally they'd hated each other. But I think when Second World War came along, they realised they had to work together. These hospitals are still there today and still functioning. Banks in Melbourne, a major part of the commercial world was banks. But they had a major image problem after the Depression. No one trusted banks. Can you imagine that? The Commonwealth Bank, owned by the government, was in the city centre, and it showed with its austerity and this simplistic style that it was solid and sound and it was a safe place to leave your money. This was landmarked by our society a few years ago, which we were very, very pleased. What happens in the city centre is people tend to think that everything's protected and then when you do a bit of research, you find that it's not. So we were pleased to have this one added to the Heritage Register. This is one of my favourite scenes in Melbourne. This is a frieze on the bank, which is showing the bank as the linchpin between agriculture, manufacturing, transport, wool, and the transport part. We're seeing each of these hands there, a train and a boat. But I love the styling of his hair, that windswept Deco style, and love the way that animals were represented in this era. So we have a poster for the zoo, which recreates a flamingo into the signage there. But it's also showing a concrete monkey pavilion, which was a fine example of concrete stylism. The only problem was that no one asked the monkeys, and so they suffered considerably from climbing up and down on concrete. And it's also showing a couple of other features of the era. You could take a fast electric train to the zoo, and you had to take your Kodak. The other image here is a shark in etched glass in a private house. It's everyone's fear of going to the beach in Australia, being taken by a shark, although you're more likely to be killed on the road to the beach than be grabbed by a shark. A few other Australian cities. This is Sydney, an apartment block in King's Cross, an inner suburb, and the Metro Cinema, wonderful design here. And there's currently a campaign to restore it to its previous function as a live theatre. So we're participating with our friends in Sydney in seeing if we can get that to happen. Down below we see a swimming pool in the shadow of the Sydney Harbour Bridge, which also has a lot of Deco styling. And we see a shop for Zinc and Sons. Now this was about as stylish as you could get. Black tiles, chrome, terrazzo, wonderful signage, that metal with just red highlights in the metalwork there. Thankfully, it's still there in Sydney. And the city of Adelaide, we'll have a look at. The one on the left is a printing firm in the middle of the city. Very, very distinctive, but it's currently under threat. We have a group in Adelaide, a chapter in Adelaide, and they're currently trying to save it. And on the right, we have the entrance to a savings bank, just showing how the lettering in those days was often just incised into the building fabric. Let's come back to Melbourne and what happened in 1942. Melbourne was occupied by the US troops, including those that were recovering from Guadalcanal. They were regarded, the Yanks were regarded as overpaid, oversexed, and over here. For many young GIs, though, this was the first big city they'd seen. A lot of them just came from small towns and from farms. Some married local girls, including my Aunt Muriel, who met a marine musician, followed him to Philadelphia, lived happily ever after. They occupied some of our best and most stylish buildings, including a brand new hospital. One of the most important buildings was McRobb Girls. And this is the result of a contest by the same man who had hosted the London to Melbourne air race. It was designed by a guy called Norman Seabrook. He just returned from England, brought his love of European modernism from him. Most influential designs in those days were from Germany and the Netherlands. He used cream bricks, large windows, and colour on the metal, and the functions of the interior section were also identified by colour. This became a Seabrook characteristic, including red doors. It had a flat roof and a little decoration except for the flagpole. Now you can imagine the terrazzo in the building took a bit of a pounding from the US troops, but they enjoyed their time in this school. Just down the road is the Prince of Wales Hotel. This was a stylish hotel. It was one of the buildings occupied by the US officers. The troops, of course, were billeted in cold football stadiums. It's recently been restored, but it certainly was the centre of a lot of activity. And many young ladies were seen to leave the Prince of Wales in the morning with a new pair of silk stockings in their bag. Post-war, we have a large number of glass curtain wall buildings, and many new designs utilise that design. This is ICI House, 1958. It was very significant because it broke the height limits rule, and it was very stylish. But it was a problem when the glass tiles started to fall off. They'd been made in Belgium, so not designed for the heat of an Australian summer. Another major building from this era was the Southern Cross Hotel. Now, this was owned by Pan Am. Tourism was starting to open up here, largely due to the Olympic Games. And it was designed by Welton Beckett, and one of many similar hotels that he did around the world. Hawaii, Honolulu has a number of his buildings. But the major event in this era was the Olympic Games of 1956. It was the highly successful, regarded as the friendly games, and Russia was the leading medal winner, followed by the USA. Here we see a torch, an Olympic torch over the city centre, and there were many, many designs on the city streets that highlighted the arrival of the Olympic Games. And we also had some wonderful additions to the Melbourne streetscapes, such as the Olympic Pool. It's a masterpiece of engineering design with its use of steel, and we see these vertical tension rods on the side there that connected to the top of the building. Now, the athletes were quartered in an Olympic village, and they were bused to the events every day, about 8 miles out. And the village included women's quarters for the first time. But frustratingly for everybody, there was a fence around the women's quarters. It was frustrating for men who wanted to get in, and there was a large scandal when male footprints were found in the garden, later found to belong to a Greek pole vaulter. But it was also frustrating for the women athletes who wanted to get out. Here we see in the top one the rudimentary security. When you think of the security that goes on in Olympic villages today, this had just a gate that was lifted by a security officer, very, very rudimentary, and the whole Olympic village had a cyclone wire fence around it. That was it. So the local kids delighted in getting into the village, which was quite easily done. In 2006, there was a 50th year anniversary. Many of the athletes returned and gathered at the village. I was a tour leader, and I certainly enjoyed sharing their stories. It's the odd thing. You can read a formal report about a building or an event, but you get real stories by talking to the people who were there, and they shared some wonderful stories with us. So where's Melbourne with preservation? We're in the preservation buildings, and we're constantly worrying about what to do with buildings. Interwar buildings are constantly under threat. In the preservation game, you win some, and we've had a number of buildings placed on the Heritage Register. It's not easy, but we've been successful with the Century building, which is shown here, wonderful white terracotta finish, and banks, Myer department store, motoring centres, houses, etc. But you lose some. And the Lonsdale House was one of Melbourne's Art Deco treasures. It was a conversion of 2 19th century warehouses in 1935. It was capped with this marvellous tower composed of various shapes. In defending this building, we were up against a combination of financial institutions, department stores, Heritage Victoria, the state government, and the City of Melbourne. Very powerful, with deep pockets. We went to a hearing and we walked in, 2 of us, and we saw the range of forces on the other side of the table, and it's one of those situations where you think, we may as well just go home now. But we nearly won it. Anyway, they succeeded in having it demolished, and we'll continue to fight for the preservation of these buildings. So our train's pulling into the station, and it's time to leave Melbourne. Let's hope that you'll be able to travel overseas soon. We'd love to have you visit Melbourne, as Jim did last year. We can assure you that you'll get a warm welcome if you do. So thank you, and I think we're going to have some questions now.
I'm always a fan of a presentation that ends with Looney Tunes. So, Robin, that was probably the sexiest Preservation Houston presentation that we've had. There were some saucy stories in there, which makes it more fun too. We do have some good questions coming in, and I want to say also, It looks like we've got folks from a number of places. We've had greetings from Maryland and Dallas and Atlanta, and I know quite a few Houstonians as well. So one thing that I was curious about, just to kick things off, you talked about some of the preservation efforts that you guys have done. Can you just outline briefly what the society does? I mean, I think it's a different kind of group than we're used to in the U.S. in that you guys are interested in preservation and appreciation of architecture, but you're also working to preserve and save it.
Yeah, of course. That's the major thing. As a society, we don't do a lot of dress ups. We concentrate more on preservation issues. And we get involved in nominating single buildings to the Heritage Register, which is our equivalent of the Landmarks Commission for you guys, I guess. That generally involves commissioning someone to do a detailed study of the building and arguing for its case. There's a number of criteria that you have to meet, and then lodging it with the authorities, and they make a decision as to whether it's included in the register or not, and or in some cases whether it should come off the register, which is a bit worrying. And it's a frustrating process because, like a lot of government departments, they've had their staffing levels slashed in the last few years. Nevertheless, we fight on. The other area that's becoming far more prevalent these days is local government areas where councils have initiated heritage overlays, and we get involved with providing advice and generally supporting the implementation of heritage overlays. Of course, a lot of people don't like the idea of having a heritage overlay on their house, and there's all sorts of misinformation out there about what you can do and what you can't do with a house that's heritage listed by the local council. But it's an interesting phenomenon, and it's certainly become a lot more prevalent in the last 10 years. I'm currently working on one in one of our better areas of South Yarra, where they're reviewing the City of Melbourne's heritage register there. So there's always something going on with heritage.
Well, and I guess in a way, it's good to know that some of the problems that we have here are the same problems that exist halfway around the world. So I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Yeah, every time we talk to other people from around the world, they share that sympathy. And the other issue, of course, we have is facadism, and that's a major problem here. And you can make up your own mind whether it's a good thing or it's a bad thing. It can be done well, or it can be done awfully. So it's a continuing concern.
Yeah, I think that's true. One question that I think is good, because you mentioned some of the architects who came to Australia from different places, were a lot of the more prominent Melbourne and Australian architects trained in Australia, or did they go abroad to get their training?
Some of them were still in England after or still in Europe after the First World War, so they stayed on there. Others just took themselves off to England, but mostly I think they relied on journals and magazines and communicating with their colleagues overseas. The difference came after the Second World War, when we had a lot of emigre architects, particularly from parts of Europe, and they brought some wonderful skills and designs with them. Unfortunately, Australia was very insular at the time, so a lot of their qualifications weren't recognised. They had to go through the process again, but they certainly made a major contribution to Melbourne's post-war years, and we're very, very fortunate to have them.
And I'm curious, just to help put things in context, before there were direct flights or even indirect flights, how long would it take you to get from, say, London to Melbourne? back in the day.
Couple of days, 3 days maybe. And yeah, this was the start of the international flying scene. And so, I mean, at the start of the 30s, you were still coming out to Melbourne by flying boat. So Pan Am Clippers were prevalent. So it was a bit of an ordeal. Eleanor Roosevelt visited Melbourne in the war years as head of the Red Cross, and I think she took a few days to get out here. She was probably in a DC-3, a Douglas DC-3, so it wouldn't have been much of a fun trip. But,
Yeah.
So let's hope we can fly international. Sorry.
I was going to say one of our members who has family in Australia just commented it still takes forever to get there, which it can seem like. I guess if you're lucky enough to be in first class, it feels like a little bit of a shorter trip. But I was wedged like in the back row of the airplane, just kind of like this for 15 hours. So, you did touch on some of the other Australian cities?
Yeah. Normally 14 hours to LA, yeah.
Yeah.
Look, but these days it's about 3 or 4 movies. There's all sorts of entertainment. But I'm afraid we don't have a lot of sympathy for people who say, "Oh, how can you spend all that time on the plane?" If we want to go anywhere, we're in for a long plane flight. So,
well, they had bottomless Kit Kats on Qantas, so that helped. You could have as many Kit Kats as you could eat. So yeah, I was happy. One question. You did touch on some other Australian cities. Are there any other Australian cities that have as much of a concentration of Art Deco as Melbourne, or is Melbourne really the place to go in Australia if you're interested in Deco?
Melbourne and Sydney. The other capitals, Adelaide, Hobart, and Brisbane, and Perth have a fair sprinkling of buildings, and they're all interesting places to go to. Because these days we're combining visits to see Deco spaces with mid-century modernism places as well. So and there's a wealth of those in some of these other cities. But as you know, it's a long way between places to see these, and a lot of country towns still have lots of Deco, and they're always well worth a visit too. So so there's no shortage of it outside of Melbourne and Sydney, that's for sure.
Would the country town buildings have been their local pub or a city hall, or what kind of buildings would you see?
Yeah. Generally those, maybe a local hospital, the local pubs. What happened with the pubs in Melbourne in the maybe in the 90s is they all got gutted for poker machines, and but this tends not to happen in the country towns. There's not enough money in the country towns to make that sort of venture worthwhile. So so it's almost preservation by default in a lot of those places.
Just sticking with the idea of tourism for a moment, we have a question from Mark. He's a Kiwi native, and he visited Napier in New Zealand last year, and he was asking how does the Art Deco architecture in Napier compare to Melbourne? And it might be good to fill everyone in on what Napier is, in case they don't know.
Okay, Napier is a town on the North Island of New Zealand, was largely destroyed by earthquake and consequent fires in the early 1930s. So when it was rebuilt in the latest style, which was Art Deco, and used a lot of concrete in their buildings. They have some interesting buildings in their city. Perhaps their major strength is the marketing that they do of their city. They do that very, very well, and they have a huge Art Deco weekend every February. But they're very active. I find the architecture there a little bit of this similar. lots of commercial buildings, and not a lot of the other buildings that make some of these cities very desirable, like schools and hospitals and factories and things like that. Nevertheless, they do it very, very well over there.
And if you travel from the U.S. to Australia, you might as well travel from Australia to New Zealand while you're in that corner of the world.
Yeah, right? You may as well. You're flying over it anyway, so
that's right. So might as well stop in. There's a lot of interest, I think, in the way that preservation differs here and there. So a couple of other questions along that line. In the U.S., we have tax credits that are available at the state and federal level to help with preservation. Is there anything similar in Australia?
No, not really. Heritage Victoria has some funding that they can make available, but generally we don't have that tax relief. There's been many times it's been pushed for, but it just hasn't come off. So I think it would be a good idea, and I'm always envious when I see developers in the States wanting to redevelop and getting tax credits for doing so. But you play with the cards that you're dealt, and so that's what we're doing.
Well, and we did not always have them over here. We're lucky that they've come in. So one other question is about are there laws that require the preservation of facades in some areas of Melbourne? And is that part of heritage overlays that you mentioned?
Yeah, there are. It's a little bit of a grey area, and the laws in the city of Melbourne, or the rules in the city of Melbourne about facadism, have been tightened up in the last few years. So it's now getting reasonably difficult for developers to do that, and that's a good thing. But it's a constant battle, as you know. There's always someone who wants to engage a lawyer or a so-called preservation architect to overcome any restrictions. It's a story that everybody in your audience would have heard many times before, I'm sure. Yeah.
It's unfortunately, I think that's true. I'm curious about, and you didn't have a photo of the interior of the Myer department store, but if anybody looks it up, you can see it's that beautiful Art Deco facade, and then the interior is beautiful too, but the interior is completely new and futuristic. So you mentioned that the building was listed, but I assume it's the facade and the surviving parts that were listed?
Yeah, that's right. Including the mural hall, which is a wonderful space. Look, we're not anti-development, and sometimes you've just got to accept that commercial realities will take precedent. We were glad that the facade of the building was listed and certain parts of the inside, but you take the view that well, these companies have to make a profit as well. And sometimes it's silly to try and fight against something that's obviously wanted by a lot of people. So Myers was getting old-fashioned and a bit dowdy. So the internal renovations certainly spruced it all up, and it's just unfortunate that now they can't open at all. So if you want something from Myers, you buy it online and click and collect. Let's hope they get back to trading soon.
Yeah, that's something else we all have in common these days, right? Is the things that are open and the things that are not. Let's see. We did. Oh, and this is a good question too, because you mentioned this a couple of times. The height restriction that existed until the 1960s. What was the basis of that, or the 50s? I guess it was.
It's just council wanted height limits, but also some practical reasons. It was largely around the height that the fire brigade's ladders could actually reach. It was regarded as the extent. And of course, the council bureaucrats were quite bloody minded for a long time. if they didn't like something, they fought tooth and nail against it. Like the Capitol Theatre that we saw, the Walter Burley Griffin one, they hated it. Their offices were over the road from it, so they didn't want to see it at all. So there was a movement to a degree to remove those height limits. The reality, though, was that we didn't have the money or the finance to build skyscrapers anyway. So the height limit in some ways suited many people. But it was a relief when it was finally removed in 1958 for the ICI building. And they did that by trading off, by convincing the council that if they put a lot of open space around the building, that would compensate for any additional stories that they were putting on. It's a little bit like in Tel Aviv. We see lots and lots of apartment blocks there, where the council is allowing them to extend upwards as long as they restore the entire building. So, trust the Israelis to come out with a very practical outcome there, and it works quite well for them. But it was good to see that. Yeah,
good to see when you can when you can come up with a creative solution that works, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And let's see. It looks like maybe one final question here. How does the number of residential buildings that are Art Deco compare with commercial? And I think that's a good question, especially from over here, because we never had, well, I'm speaking for Houston, other parts of the US did, but in Texas, we never had that many residential Deco buildings.
Yeah, we had quite a few houses designed. Generally, they were designed for people who could afford to engage an architect, and people who weren't at all concerned about what the neighbours thought of it. We were a very English based city for a very long time, and so people resented they regarded the intrusion with these stylish houses as almost American, so to be disparaged. But there were a lot of houses in that style. But the main thing that happened was the apartment blocks, and they were centred in a number of suburbs close to the city, and there are some suburbs that are just dominated by Deco design. And thankfully, a lot of young people these days are realising what great designs it was, because you see the new flats going up are generally small and cramped, whereas the Deco ones always had a lot of space and a lot of style. As far as measuring the numbers, I'm not sure I can do that. Most suburbs had a few, at least a few great Deco buildings, picture theatres, like maybe the town hall, as you said, schools, and factories. There were some wonderful factory designs. The factories themselves, though, tended to be pretty basic, and the office and sales section at the front was in very stylish Deco design. Someone described as like putting lipstick on a pig. So I'm not really sure that I can answer the question. I guess one thing you do find, though, is wherever we go in Melbourne, there are examples of the style that are still there, and were very good examples of the style.
Well, and Melbourne architecture, or the little bit of it I got to see beyond Deco, is pretty incredible. There's some amazing Victorian buildings, and the older things and the newer things. It's a really rich city architecturally that hopefully one of these days, when the world opens back up, everybody can go visit again.
Well, we'd love to welcome you. Yeah.
Yeah, Jennifer says, Robin, thank you for your society's preservation efforts and for sharing your passion and for showing so many beautiful buildings. She says she's partial to Deco, but she enjoyed seeing all of them. And I echo that. It was wonderful to get to see some architecture from the other side of the world, and great to see you. And thanks for taking the time out of your morning to be with us.
Oh, thank you, Jennifer, and thank you to some of our other friends who we think were tuned in as well. So
it's weird to think he's sharing part of his morning when the sun is going down right now.
Yeah, I should ask questions about what happens tomorrow, but I'm sure you get that all the time.
Thank you, Robin, for being with us. Thank you, Jim, and thanks to everyone who tuned in tonight. Our next big program is our first online Good Brick Tour that's going to feature award-winning historic homes and buildings that we can't logistically show during the live event. So you're going to see a lot of properties we wanted to show, but just haven't been able to during the live tour. Our first video will take you inside the Tudor Revival Meyer Hall House in Cortlandt Place, and it will premiere at 10 a.m. Saturday, October 10th. Go to preservationhouston.org/goodbricktour, all one word, to find the details about the tour. That's where you'll also go to watch the videos and where you can donate to gain access to our special bonus video of the Esperson buildings downtown. If you ever wanted to go to the top of the Esperson building in Tempietto, this is your chance. Warden Name Special Events is producing the videos. They're doing a great job. We've got drones going up the sides of buildings, so you'll be able to see details that you can't see from ground level. It's really going to be a special event. Again, preservationhouston.org/goodbricktour. The first video goes online October 10th, and then we'll premiere videos every Saturday morning from the 10th through the 31st. If you're a member of Preservation Houston, we're very grateful for your support. If you're not a member, please consider joining. You can do that on our website as well. Thank you all for being with us, and enjoy the rest of your evening.